2 coneflowers. Same bench, same nursery, same Saturday afternoon. Same price, near enough. Same little plastic tag on a stick, with the same cheerful promise printed on the back. You take one home, your neighbor takes the other. 5 years from now, one of those plants is a standing colony. 3 feet across, seeding itself into the gravel path where you did not ask it to. Feeding goldfinches in February. The other has been gone so long you have forgotten you ever bought it. You replaced it, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you decided the problem was you. Your soil, your winter, your watering can. It was not you. One number. When the Chicago Botanic Garden ran a 5-year, side-by-side trial on coneflowers, roughly half of them showed good survival across the span of that trial. Half, not half of the doubtful ones, half of the coneflowers. Same bed, same soil, same weather, same hands watering all of them on the same days. The difference was not the month they went in the ground, and it was not the gardener. The difference was which name was printed on the tag. This is Golden Harvest, and today I am not handing you a planting tip. I am handing you somebody else's homework. Years of it, done carefully, published for free, sitting where almost nobody looks. 15 perennials worth planting this month, but for each one you get more than planted in August. You get which specific selection has been measured standing up through multiple winters in a public trial, and which popular one quietly failed while its tag kept making promises. And on this list, there is one plant whose winner was not bred by anybody. Somebody found it growing wild on a riverbank in Tennessee, dug a piece of it, and it went on to beat nearly every professionally bred variety it was tested against. I will tell you which one, and why that is not a charming story but the whole lesson of this video, standing on a riverbank, waiting to be noticed. Let me tell you what a trial garden is, because most people hear the phrase and picture something academic that has nothing to do with their front bed. Somebody takes one kind of plant, coneflowers say, then they acquire every version of it they can get hold of. Not 5, every named variety on the market, plus the plain wild species for comparison. They plant them all in the same ground, in rows, same soil, same rain, same winter. And then they wait. That is the part that matters. At the Chicago Botanic Garden, Richard Hawk is Director of Ornamental Plant Research, and his perennials sit in those rows a minimum of 4 years. Shrubs and vines get 6. Each plant is scored for flowers, foliage, habit, how it adapts to that soil, disease and pest trouble, and winter injury. That last column is the honest one. Winter injury is where marketing copy goes to die. In Hawkesson, Delaware, Mount Cuba Center runs the same idea on native plants and their cultivars. Sam Hoadley is Horticultural Research Manager. George Coombs is Director of Horticulture and ran several trials I will quote today. Their trials run 3 years in a low-input, low-maintenance garden. Nobody babies them. Nobody stakes the ones that flop to improve the photograph. And out west, Colorado State University runs a perennial trial garden under Rocky Mountain conditions. Now the question I want you to stop on: why have you never heard of any of this? You have gardened 30 years, maybe 40. You read the catalogs. You have stood at that bench 100 times. And professional horticulturists have been growing hundreds of varieties side by side for decades, publishing exactly which ones failed, and it never reached you. It is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. A trial report cannot be patented. It cannot be trademarked. It cannot be grown in a pot and shipped to a retailer on a rolling cart. There is not one company on earth whose quarterly numbers improve when you read a free document saying the variety they developed came in 31st out of 94. Information nobody owns gets no advertising budget. So the plastic tag, which is an advertisement, ends up in your hand, and the trial report, which is a measurement, sits in a filing cabinet on the internet. Hawk has named the consequence himself. Introducing plants is a national and international industry, but regional trialing does not always happen before those plants reach the garden center. And the result of that gap is a discouraged gardener. That gardener is who I am talking to. If you have ever stood over a dead spot and quietly concluded you are not good at this, consider that you were handed a plant nobody tested where you live and then handed the blame for it. Now I have to be straight with you about the month, because the premise behind this video's title is only half true. You will hear that these plants prefer August, that they bloom harder and stand stronger than the same plant put in the ground in May. I went looking for that evidence and I cannot find it. There is no trial where somebody planted the same variety in spring and in late summer and measured the late summer plants coming out ahead. Prefer is a strong word, doing work the data does not support. Here is the version I can defend, and it is more useful anyway. August is not the magic window. August is the calm window. In May, you ask a plant to do 3 hard things at once: build roots in cold ground, push out a full canopy, and do both while heat and day length climb toward the hardest weeks of its year. In late August, the ground is as warm as it gets all year. The nights have let go, and day length is already shrinking, so nothing is pushing the plant to build more canopy. Everything says, settle in, not show off. And there is a second advantage that is not biological at all. August is when you can buy the right plant. The bench holds small plants, odd varieties, marked down stock, things not in bloom, which cuts against every instinct you have in a garden center. The small one that is not flowering is the better buy. Now the mechanism underneath this whole month, and I have never once heard it explained in a video like this. Every plant you put in the ground now is running 2 races, and almost every guide only knows about the first. Race 1 is grip. Roots have to leave that pot-shaped ball of bark and peat and take hold of your actual ground. Warm soil, 6 weeks, all of it, true enough. Race 2 is ripening, and that is the one that decides who lives. A perennial does not simply stop growing when cold comes. It ripens. Shortening days and cooling nights are a signal, and the plant answers by rebuilding its own chemistry. It pulls water out of its tissues. It concentrates sugars and other solutes inside its cells, which lowers the temperature at which the water in them will freeze and tear the cell apart. It moves reserves down out of the leaves into the crown and roots, and it hardens the tissue that has to survive being frozen solid for months. Horticulturists call that cold acclimation. At the garden bed, I call it ripening, because that is what it looks like. It takes weeks, and it cannot be hurried. So a plant can win race 1 and lose race 2. It can be beautifully rooted in October, anchored, gripping your soil with everything it has, and die in December because it never finished ripening, which gives you something to act on before dark tonight. Nitrogen unripens a plant. Feed a perennial in late summer, and you send one instruction: make soft new leaves and soft new stems. Soft tissue is unripe tissue. You have told the plant to keep growing at the exact moment its survival depended on shutting down. Then the first freeze takes that tender growth, and the plant spends reserves it was supposed to be banking just recovering from an injury you caused with a kindness. So do not fertilize in August is not a rule of thumb somebody inherited. It is the most mechanical sentence in this video. Put the bag down. That is the whole technique, and it costs nothing, which is exactly why nobody advertises it. How long do you need? Most extension services land somewhere around 6 weeks of real growing weather before the ground freezes in earnest. But a round carries weight, and anybody handing you a hard date for the whole country is guessing. Your frost date, your soil, your drainage, and your slope are local facts. Your county extension office has them, knows your USDA hardiness zone, and will tell you for free. Before I name names, 3 warnings, because I could read winners at you for 20 minutes, and then I would have done to you exactly what the tag does. First, a trial is regional, and that is not a footnote. Mount Cuba describes the Mid-Atlantic. Chicago Botanic describes the Upper Midwest. Colorado State describes the Rocky Mountain West. A plant that won in Delaware is a strong hypothesis in Phoenix, not a promise. Hawk says it himself, and it is the most useful sentence in the field. Regional adaptation matters more than national reputation. Second, top performer is a score, not a guarantee. These are averages across a few years in one bed, and Hawk is direct that a strange winter can move a plant either way. Third, a trial measures what it chose to measure. The Phlox trial deliberately tested powdery mildew because mildew is what ruins phlox. The Coreopsis trial looked hard at longevity. A winner won at what somebody selected, which may not be what kills it in your yard. Given all 3, here is the part to keep. The loser list travels better than the winner list. If a variety placed near the top in Delaware, that tells you it is worth trying where you are. Useful, but soft. If a variety rotted or mildewed or died out in its third year in Delaware and in Illinois and in Colorado, in 3 climates with 3 different problems, that plant is not telling you something regional. It is telling you something about itself. Weakness generalizes. Strength does not. So do not just read the honor roll. Look for the famous varieties missing from it. That absence is the most honest information in the document, and the only place in this industry where you learn what does not work without paying for the lesson yourself. 15 plants, 4 groups, because they fail for 4 different reasons. Once you see the pattern, you will diagnose plants I never mention. Group 1 is where the trials embarrass the market, where what everybody buys is not what lives. Plant 1, purple coneflower, echinacea, half survived that 5-year trial, so what separated them? The plain wild purple coneflower is a seed-grown prairie plant with a taproot and a long history of surviving, whatever the middle of this continent does to it. Most coneflowers on that bench are not that. Since the 1990s, breeders have crossed several coneflower species to get colors the plant never had. Orange, coral, deep red. Those complex hybrids are usually propagated in a laboratory by tissue culture, grown fast, and shipped to you in flower. Think about what gets selected there. The plant is chosen because it looks spectacular in a pot in its first season, and a first season is precisely when a weak plant can fake it. Whether it has the crown and root architecture for 5 winters takes 5 years to answer, and nobody in that supply chain is waiting. You are not buying a bad plant. You are buying a plant judged on a test that has nothing to do with what you need from it. In the Mount Cuba coneflower trial, the best performers included Pica Bella, Sensation Pink, Santa Fe, Snow Cone, Glowing Dream, Purple Emperor, and Fragrant Angel. Fragrant Angel was the standout for pollinators, drawing the most visits overall and the most butterfly visits of any of them. And here is the detail I find moving. When the plain wild species, no cultivar name, no trademark, was included for comparison, it placed right near the top for pollinators. The plant nobody makes money on held its own against everything done to improve it. One honest note that will cost me comments. Those double coneflowers, the shaggy pom-pom ones, the extra petals did not come from nowhere. They are modified from the reproductive parts at the center, which is the part holding the nectar and pollen an insect came for. Grow them if you love them. Just know you bought a flower rebuilt for your eye, not for the bee. Plant now, and leave every seed head standing this fall. Goldfinches strip them through winter, and the plant seeds a small colony around itself, which is the cheapest garden expansion there is. Plant 2, garden phlox. This is the riverbank story. Everybody who grows tall phlox knows its betrayal. Beautiful for 3 weeks, then the leaves turn to gray, felt from the bottom up. Powdery mildew. Most people respond by spraying, or by deciding phlox is a plant for other people. Mount Cuba went at it properly. Over 3 years, they grew 94 selections of sun-loving phlox, plus 43 of the shade-loving kinds. With hundreds packed into one location, the mildew pressure was severe, which sounds like a flaw and is the opposite. Brutal conditions separate a genuinely resistant plant from a lucky one. The winner was a plant named Gina. Gina came out of no breeding program. Somebody found it growing on a riverside in Nashville, Tennessee, and brought it into cultivation because it resisted mildew. It became the top performer, and then volunteers counting pollinators found something nobody went looking for. Over 2 years, they recorded more than 500 butterfly visits to Gina, by a wide margin the most of any phlox in the trial. A wild plant off a riverbank beat the laboratory. Here is why that is a lesson and not an anecdote, straight from Coombs, who ran it. He specifically wanted to test cultivars from European breeding programs, and his reasoning is what I want lodged in your head. Disease pressures in Europe are different from ours. So a plant advertised as disease-resistant may be telling the truth about a disease it met in Germany and telling you nothing about the mildew on your fence line in Ohio. Sure enough, the top performers were almost all from American cultivation or found in the wild. Disease-resistant is not a lie. It is a sentence with a missing location. Now the mechanism, which you can check with your own eyes before buying. Powdery mildew is an unusual fungus. Most fungal diseases need free water on a leaf. This one does not. It thrives in humid, still air, on crowded foliage, in a plant whose interior never dries. Gina has narrow leaves and small flowers, and air moves through it, so the technique falls out of the mechanism. Alongside Gina, strong performers included Delta Snow, Robert Poor, David, and Glamour Girl. Whichever you plant, give it room. Do not tuck it against a fence. Thin the weakest stems out of the clump in spring so the middle can breathe. You are not fighting a fungus, you are managing airflow. Plant 3, Bee Balm, Monarda. The pattern repeats so exactly that I laughed when I read the report. Mount Cuba grew 40 Monarda selections, ranked on vigor, pollinator attraction, and disease resistance, which for bee balm means mildew again. Every gardener listening has watched a beautiful patch turn to gray dust by mid-August. The clear winner was Claire Grace, a naturally occurring form of Monarda fistulosa, not a hybrid, a wild form of a wild species, given a name. Its display held 3 full weeks without fading and pulled well over 100 visits from butterflies and moths. Jacob Klein also came through strong on disease. And then the detail that tells you everything. Most of the pure species in that trial did well against mildew too. Not the improved ones, the plain ones. Now the mechanism, and it is on no tag I have ever read. 2 bee balms sit behind almost everything you can buy, and they come from completely different places. Monarda didyma is a streamside plant, at home in moist, rich, sheltered ground near running water in the eastern mountains. Monarda fistulosa is a dry prairie plant. Open ground, full sun, lean soil, wind. The great majority of showy garden bee balms, the deep reds and hot pinks, come out of didyma, and much of that breeding happened in Europe. So here is what you have been doing, and I have done it too. Buying a streamside plant, putting it in a dry, sunny border with mulch around it and a house wall blocking the air, then blaming yourself when it gets sick. You did not fail. You put a wetland plant in a prairie and asked it to be happy. So the fix is not a fungicide. If your spot is dry, open, sunny, and windy, plant a fistulosa type like Claire Grace, and the mildew problem largely evaporates. If you genuinely have a moist, half-shaded corner near a downspout, didyma types are finally home and will reward you. One honest thing, all of them spread by underground runners. Not aggressively, but in 4 years the clump will be considerably wider than you planted it. That is free plants if you want them, and a chore if you do not, and you should decide which before you dig, not after. Plant 4, Coreopsis, tick seed. For this one, I will just tell you what the institution that ran the trial says, because they put it more bluntly than I would have dared. Mount Cuba's own summary says, there is a great deal of confusion among gardeners because some perennial cultivars do not perform as well as advertised, that they may be short-lived perennials, or may in fact behave like annuals, and that many are prone to pests and disease. That is a botanical garden stating in public that plants sold to you as perennials are not reliably perennial. 94 selections went through 3 years of evaluation to arrive at that sentence. Now the mechanism, and this one saves you money for the rest of your life. Look at the Coreopsis display anywhere. Plain yellows, and then the extraordinary ones. Raspberry pinks, wine reds, caramels and creams with a dark eye. Those colors are relatively new, and they arrived because breeders crossed the tough northern species with tender Coreopsis species from the far south and beyond. The color came in on the same ticket as the tenderness. You did not buy a hardier Coreopsis with a nicer color. You bought a genuinely less hardy plant, and the color is what you paid for. That is not a scandal, it is plant breeding. Nobody put that sentence on the tag because it does not sell a pot. 2 honest paths. If you want a plant still there in 6 years, stay with the threadleaf types, Coreopsis verticillata. Zagreb is the tougher, more vigorous, more upright of the 2 everyone knows. Moonbeam is the softer, pale lemon one, genuinely beautiful, and honestly less durable for many gardeners in cold, wet ground. If your winters are wet, take Zagreb. If you want the wine reds and caramels, buy them, enjoy them, and file them as a 2-season plant at the front of a bed where you will not resent replacing them. The mistake is not buying them. The mistake is expecting furniture when you bought cut flowers. And do not feed coreopsis or plant it in rich ground. It really does bloom better lean, and the mechanism is plain. Available nitrogen pushes a plant toward leaves and stems and away from flowers. That is not stress-producing beauty. That is the plant obeying the instruction you gave it. Group 2 is 4 plants killed by kindness, and I need to correct a piece of folklore first. You will hear these bloom harder when you stress them. That neglect triggers a survival instinct. Nothing in a plant decides to make flowers because it feels threatened. The real mechanism is simpler. Available nitrogen shifts a plant toward leaves and stems. Take it away and the same energy goes to flowers. You are not stressing it. You are not giving it a reason to build a hedge. The second half matters more. What kills these 4 is not winter cold. It is winter wet. A saturated crown sitting in mud through every freeze and thaw from December to March rots from the middle out. When I say drainage, I am not talking about summer. I am talking about February. Plant 5. Blanket flower. Gaillardia. Honest first, this is a short-lived plant. 2 good years, sometimes 3. That is the plant, not your fault, not fixable, and anybody saying otherwise is selling the replacement. Within those years it works harder than almost anything, and August suits it because it enters its first winter with an unsaturated crown. Arizona Sun and Goblin, also sold as Kobold, are the compact, reliable ones. Full sun, poor soil, no fertilizer at all. And the free technique, let some flowers go to seed instead of deadheading everything. Gaillardia seeds itself readily, and the seedlings replace the parent on their own schedule. You stop buying blanket flower forever. Plant 6. Hyssop, Agastache. There is an ongoing Agastache evaluation at Chicago Botanic right now, which tells you the industry has made enough of these to need sorting out. Carry this mechanism out of the whole group. The showy hummingbird hyssops, the coral and apricot and smoky purple ones, largely descend from species out of the desert southwest and northern Mexico. They evolved in ground that drains in minutes. They do not die of January cold. They die of February mud. Now think about what standard fall advice tells you to do. Mulch generously over the crown for winter protection. For this plant, that advice is the murder weapon. Mulch on the crown holds moisture against it through every thaw. You are not insulating it. You are building it a wet compress and leaving it for 4 months. So the technique inverts. Plant Agastache slightly high, on a low mound so water runs away from the crown. Put an inch of coarse grit at the base instead of bark. Mulch the soil around it if you like, but leave the crown open to the air. Free, 2 minutes, and the difference between living and vanishing. Want the safe bet? Anise hyssop, Agastache funiculum, is the tough upper Midwestern one and far more forgiving. The flashy hybrids are worth growing. Just grow them on a mound. Plant 7. Beard tongue, Penstemon. Same story, different genus, and now I can give you a rule instead of a list. The eastern species, Penstemon digitalis, is a moist meadow plant from the middle and east of this country, and it is close to bulletproof. Husker Red is the one most people know. It was selected and released in 1983 by Dr. Dale Lindgren at the University of Nebraska, and the Perennial Plant Association named it Perennial Plant of the Year in 1996. A land-grant university breeder, and then a verdict from the industry's own growers. That is a strong record. The western species are a different animal, out of dry mountain and desert country, needing drainage so sharp that most garden soil kills them in their first wet winter. But Husker Red also gives me the sharpest example in this whole video of why a tag is not a promise, and I want you to hear it because it will change how you shop. Husker Red is prized for deep burgundy foliage. Many nurseries, however, have propagated it from seed rather than from cuttings. Seedlings of a named plant are not clones of it, so a great many plants sold as Husker Red simply do not have the dark leaf color the original had. Sit with that. The name on the tag is correct. The plant behind the name has drifted. So even doing everything right, even reading the cultivar name and buying the trial winner, you can end up with something paler than what was measured, which is the last reason to buy the small, ungainly plant you can actually look at, rather than ordering a name sight unseen. Look at the leaves in the pot. If they are green, that is what you are taking home. Here is the rule, and it works across the whole nursery trade. Read the species name on the tag, not the cultivar name. The cultivar name was chosen by a marketing department. Husker red, dark towers, blackbeard. Those words tell you what the plant looks like and nothing about where it can live. The species name, that second word in the italic Latin, is the plant's home address. It tells you what climate built it. Learn 6 or 7 species names in the genera you actually grow, and you can read a bench faster than the person working there. One honesty note. I do not know of a large multi-year public trial covering the whole penstemon genus the way Mount Cuba covered Coreopsis, so I am not going to invent one or hand you a ranked list that does not exist. Plant it now, high and dry, no mulch on the crown. Plant 8. Blazing Star. Liatris. It is here partly because August is the month to buy it cheap, and partly because almost everybody plants it wrong for one reason. Liatris does not grow from a fibrous root system. It grows from a corm, a flattened solid storage structure sitting just under the surface. A corm is a fundamentally different object from a root ball. Roots tolerate damp, corms rot. 2 things follow. Plant it shallow, an inch or 2 of soil over the top, and put it in the driest, sunniest, best-drained ground you own. Plant Liatris deep in heavy soil because that feels safer and you have buried a potato in a swamp. The other August point. This is bargain bin season for dormant corms, and much of what is left has sat in a warm, dry store for months. Before you buy, press 1 between your fingers. It should feel firm and heavy, like a water chestnut. If it feels light and gives under your thumb like a stale marshmallow, it has dried out and will not come back. Put it down. Nobody at the register will tell you that. Leave the seed heads standing in fall. Goldfinches work Liatris hard through winter, and the vertical stems catch snow. Group 3 is the fall bloomers, and this is where August makes the most sense, because these plants are awake right now. They are heading into their season, so they can root and perform in the same weeks. Plant 9. New England Aster. I will bust the big myth about it shortly. Right now, the mechanism. Tall wild asters flop, and everybody blames themselves. Here is why. A species aster is a prairie plant, and on a prairie it grows shoulder to shoulder inside a crowd of grasses and perennials that hold it upright. It never needed a self-supporting stem because it was never standing alone. Then you put it in the middle of a mulched bed by itself, feed the bed, and ask a plant that evolved to lean on neighbors to stand unassisted in the open. It cannot. It was never built to. 3 real fixes, none involving the calendar. 1. Buy a cultivar that is genetically short. Purple Dome is the one to know, and now I get to close a loop for you. Purple Dome is a Mount Cuba Center introduction. But look at where it came from. It was first spotted growing along a Pennsylvania roadside below Allentown by a man named Robert Seep, who gave it to Mount Cuba, and Mount Cuba released it in 1989. It reaches about 2 feet, because that is simply what that roadside plant was. So think about what you now know. The best garden phlox in that trial was found on a riverbank in Tennessee. The best compact aster on this list was found on the shoulder of a Pennsylvania highway. 2 of the strongest plants in this entire video were noticed by somebody who was paying attention on an ordinary day, and neither of them was designed by anyone. That is worth remembering the next time a tag implies that newer means better. Sometimes the best plant available was already standing by the road, and the whole achievement was somebody stopping the car. And in fairness, Mount Cuba is honest about Purple Dome's one flaw. It can pick up foliar problems late in the season. Short and reliable, not perfect. That is what real evaluation sounds like. 2. Cut the tall ones back by 1/3 to 1/2 in June or early July. The English call it the Chelsea chop. The plant branches out instead of up. 3. Grow it in a crowd, in leaner soil, with grasses around it, and let it lean the way it was designed to. One honest note from the University of Wisconsin Extension. Asters are best planted in spring. So in Zone 4 or colder, buy now while selection is good. Keep it potted somewhere sheltered. Plant in April. Zone 5 and warmer, plant now and mulch after the ground freezes. Plant 10, sneezeweed, Helenium. Mount Cuba trialed this genus too, and can rated highly. First, let me take a burden off you. The name is a slander. Helenium does not cause hay fever. It got called sneezeweed because the dried disc florets were once ground and used as snuff, deliberately, to make people sneeze. Its pollen is heavy and insect-carried, not wind-carried. It has never made anybody's allergies worse, and the name has cost it a century of sales. The mechanism is the aster lesson with a different face. Helenium flops when soil is too rich or when it has been fertilized. Feed it, and you get 5 feet of soft stem holding a heavy flower head, and the first storm lays it flat. Same fix. Cut it back in mid-June to force branching, shorter stems, more flowers. This one breaks the last group's pattern in a way that matters. Helenium wants average to moist soil. It is not a dry ground plant. So if you have a spot that stays a little damp and you have struggled to fill it with something that blooms in September, this is your plant. Full sun, decent moisture, no fertilizer, haircut in June. Deer and rabbits leave it alone, which for some of you is the only sentence here that mattered. Plant 11, Japanese anemone. This one gets in on a different kind of evidence, and I want to name it because people undervalue it. The white one, Honorine Jobert, has been in cultivation since 1858. Sit with that. It has passed hand to hand between gardeners for close to 170 years, through every fashion and every new introduction promising something better. Nobody holds a patent. Nobody advertises it. It survives purely because generation after generation divided it, gave it away, and it kept being worth having. That is the longest trial there is, and nobody is rigging it, because there is no money in it. When a plant has been free and unpatented for a century and a half, and people still grow it, that verdict beats any tag. Mechanism and honesty. It spreads by underground rhizomes and root suckers, not surface runners, so it widens slowly into a colony over years. In a big shaded area that is a gift. In a small tight bed, it is something you will manage. And the honest part the competitor skipped. Japanese anemone is slow to establish, famously unimpressive in year 1. And in cold zones, it is commonly recommended as a spring planting for exactly that reason. So in zones 4 and 5, put it on your spring list. Zone 6 and warmer, plant now in part shade in soil that holds moisture. Water consistently this first fall, and be patient. Year 1 disappoints. Year 3 is why you planted it. Plant 12, Turtlehead, Chalone. I put it here deliberately because everything I have said for 10 minutes has been about drainage, and here is the exception along with a change of mind. You have a corner. Everybody does. The low spot by the downspout, the place at the bottom of the slope where water sits 2 days after a storm, the strip on the north side that never dries. You have tried 3 things there, and they sulked or rotted. You have started thinking of it as a problem to fix with drainage tile and a truckload of soil. Stop. That corner is not a defect. It is a habitat, and there are plants whose entire evolutionary history happened in exactly those conditions. Turtlehead is a floodplain plant. Its roots are adapted to soil with low oxygen, which is precisely why what you tried before died there, and this will not. The flowers look like a small pink or white turtle's head with its mouth open, and they come in late summer into fall, when almost nothing else in shade is doing anything. And for the wildlife side, Chalone is a host plant for the Baltimore checkerspot butterfly. Not a nectar stop, a host plant, meaning the caterpillars can only develop on it. Plant it and you are not decorating, you are providing. Part shade, consistently moist to wet, plant it now, and stop apologizing for your wet corner. It is the most valuable ground you own, and you have been trying to get rid of it. Group 4 is 3 plants that hold a bed together for years, and the first contains the most expensive misunderstanding in this video. Plant 13, Black-Eyed Susan, Rudbeckia. 2 completely different plants are sold under that name, side by side, same price, and the tag will not tell you which you have. Rudbeckia hirta is a short-lived perennial that often behaves as a biennial, and in plenty of gardens simply behaves as an annual. Indian summer, cherry brandy, prairie sun. All hirta selections. Big, beautiful flowers. Not furniture. Rudbeckia fulgida is the long-lived one. The selection to know is goldsturm, and it will hold a spot for a decade and widen every year. The mechanism is a difference in life strategy, and it repeats all over the plant world. Hirta pours its resources into seed. It is built to flower hard, set enormous quantities of seed, and let the next generation take over. Fulgida pours resources into rhizome. It is built to persist in place and spread slowly from the crown. Neither is better. They are answers to different problems, but they are sold under one common name, and that is why so many people are convinced Black-Eyed Susan is unreliable. It is not unreliable. You bought the cedar and expected the spreader. So, the rule again, read the species. Want a plant still in that spot in 8 years? Look for Fulgida and the name Goldsturm. Want a cheerful, self-seeding drift that moves around your garden on its own? Hirta is wonderful, and now you know to leave the seed heads up so it can do its job. Plant 14. Culver's root, Veronicastrum virginicum. After all this talk about flopping, here is the plant that solves it. Culver's root sends up straight, strong, woody-based stems, 4 to 6 feet tall, topped with narrow white or pale lilac candles, and it does not need staking. Not in rich soil, not in wind, not after rain. The stems are genuinely lignified, stiffened with the same structural material a shrub uses, and it is a deep-rooted prairie species, so it has an anchor underneath. If you have spent years staking things, planting one is a small revelation. It is the vertical line in the bed you never have to touch. The honest part, this plant is slow. Year 1, it is a stick with a few leaves, and you will wonder what you paid for. Year 2, it is respectable. Year 3, it is the plant in the photograph. Nothing will hurry it. Deep-rooted prairie perennials spend their early years underground where you cannot admire them, which is exactly why nobody sells them hard. There is no impulse purchase in a plant whose pitch is, wait 3 years. Full sun to light shade, average to moist soil, no fertilizer, no staking ever. Plant it now, and write the date on a label, so in 3 years, you know who to credit. Plant 15, hardy geranium, not the red pelargoniums in the window box, which are a different plant, with an unfortunate shared name. I mean true geranium, cranesbill. This has the deepest evidence behind it of anything on the list. Richard Hawk at Chicago Botanic evaluated more than 180 varieties of hardy geranium over roughly 15 years. That is not a trial, that is a career. Roseanne is where most people land, and its long bloom season is why. But the mechanism is why it is on my list, and it is a soil argument, not a flower argument. Hardy geranium sprawls. It makes a low, dense mat of foliage that runs sideways and knits into everything around it. Most people read that as untidiness. See it as function. That mat is a living mulch. It covers bare ground, which shades the soil surface, which lowers soil temperature, which slows moisture loss, which keeps the biology in that top few inches alive and working through summer instead of baking dormant. It shades out weed seedlings before they start, and unlike a bag of bark it never needs replacing, it feeds the soil as its own leaves die back, and it costs nothing after the first pot. That is this channel's whole philosophy, growing sideways across a bed. You are not decorating the ground, you are covering it. And living soil is covered soil. Bare earth is not neutral. It is an injury, and this is the cheapest bandage there is. Shear it back by half if it tires in midsummer, and it will come again. Plant it now, at the front of a bed, and let it do what it wants. Every video on this channel has this section, and I am not skipping it because this time the myths are popular ones. Myth 1. That planting an aster in August makes it stand up without staking, because shortening days suppress its tendency to grow tall. That is a mechanism somebody invented, and it sounds convincing, which is what makes it worth correcting. Day length in an aster controls when it flowers. It does not permanently reprogram how tall the plant grows. Aster height is genetics. Purple dome is 1 to 2 feet because it was selected to be. Alma potchki is 3 to 4 feet for the same reason. An aster planted in August is short in September because it is a young plant that has not grown yet. Next September, same spot, it will be exactly as tall as its genes say, and if it is a tall one in rich soil, it will flop just as hard as it ever did. The planting date bought you nothing. The cultivar choice, the June cutback, and leaner soil are what buy you a standing plant. Myth 2. That 6 to 8 weeks is exactly the window a garden mum needs, so buy one now, and you have a perennial for a decade. I want to be fair, because the instinct is right. and buying in August beats buying in October. But the promise is too big and the mechanism is backwards. Iowa State University Extension says fall-planted garden mums usually do not survive the winter, even when given winter protection, and that spring is the best time to plant them. Virginia Cooperative Extension says the later they are planted, the lower the survival rate, then gives the mechanism, which is the opposite of what you will hear. Because of the short days of fall, mums are naturally programmed to be flowering right now, not producing roots. And Illinois Extension explains the actual cause of death, which is that the shallow fibrous root system gets frozen as the top layer of soil freezes and thaws through winter. So the honest version: if you want to try, buy a small one that is not yet in flower. Get it in the ground as early this month as you can. Do not cut it back in fall. And put 3 to 4 inches of light airy mulch over the crown after the ground freezes. That is the best fall bed available. Spring planting is still the reliable road. Do not spend real money expecting 10 years. Myth 3, and this is a safety matter, so I will be direct. You will hear ornamental kale recommended on lists like this, with a cheerful note that it is edible. So cook it, put it in soup, blend it into a smoothie, free food from your own garden. Please do not do that with nursery-bought ornamental kale. 2 problems. First, it is a cool season annual and does not belong on a perennial list at all. Second, and this is what matters, ornamental plants are grown under a completely different set of rules from food crops. Ornamental kale from a garden center may have been treated with pesticides or herbicides carrying no food crop label at all, and ornamental production also commonly uses growth regulators to hold plants compact for retail. The rule with pesticide labels runs one direction, and it is strict. If the label does not specifically say it is permitted on edible crops, it is not permitted. Silence is not permission. So grow ornamental kale for the color, which is genuinely spectacular after frost. If you want kale to eat, buy seeds sold for eating and grow it yourself, and you will know exactly what went on it. And that goes for everything in your shed. Whatever you spray on anything, read the label, every time. That is not filler, and it is not me covering myself. The label is the only document in this hobby legally required to tell you the truth. I am a gardener, not a doctor. I am not going to tell anybody what to eat or what it will do for their health. That is between you and the person with the medical degree. So you have planted. Here is the list for the next 6 weeks, and every item is free. Water deep and seldom. Soak thoroughly at planting. Then check with your finger, not the calendar. Push it into the soil an inch or 2, and if it is damp, walk away. Frequent shallow watering trains roots to stay at the surface, the exact opposite of what you are building. No nitrogen. Soft growth is unripe growth, and unripe tissue is what winter takes. Do not cut anything back this fall. Leave the stems standing. They hold snow, catch leaves, trap a layer of still air around the crown, and feed birds. Cut them in early spring when you see new growth at the base. Mulch after the ground freezes. Not now. People get this backwards every year. The purpose of winter mulch is not to keep soil warm. It is to keep soil evenly cold, so it stops thawing and refreezing and shoving your new plants up out of the ground. Mulch early and warm, and you have insulated the soil against freezing, which is the opposite of the job. Wait for the ground to go hard, then cover it. And label everything, variety, name, and date, on something that survives a winter. Because 18 months from now, when one of these is thriving and one is not, that label is your own trial data. That is how you stop needing anybody else's, mine included. Let me put the whole thing in one sentence, because if you remember nothing else, I want it to be this. Stop shopping by species. Start shopping by evidence. The tag in your hand is an advertisement. The trial report is a measurement. They both cost you nothing, and only one of them has something to lose by telling you the truth. Every institution I named publishes where anybody can read it. Mount Cuba Center, the Chicago Botanic Garden, Colorado State, your own state's extension service, funded by your taxes, existing specifically to answer your questions. None of it is behind a paywall. All of it is invisible, for the plain reason that nobody can sell it to you. That is the pattern I keep running into on this channel. In soil, in mulch, in watering, and now in shopping. The techniques that actually work tend to be the ones nobody can patent, package, or brand. Which means the free thing is not the cheap alternative to the good thing. Very often the free thing is the good thing, and its only real problem is that it has no salesman. Now I want to hear from you, and I want 3 specific things, not just a zone. First, tell me which plant tag lied to you. Name the variety, the one that said hardy, that you planted properly, that was gone in 2 seasons. Collectively, this comment section knows more about what fails in America than any single trial garden does. Second, disagree with me. I told you not to pile mulch over the crown of a hyssop. If your grandmother mulched everything she owned and her plants lived 30 years, say so and tell me where you garden. I would rather have the counterexample than the applause. Third, tell me the method somebody in your family used that predates all of this. The thing your father did with a wheelbarrow that made no sense and worked anyway. Tell me what it was, and I will tell you honestly whether there is a mechanism behind it or whether it is folklore we keep because it is ours. Both are fine answers. They are just different answers, and this channel will not pretend one is the other. And when you tell me your zone, tell me your worst drained corner too. That corner is where half of what I said today gets decided. This has been Golden Harvest. Feed the soil, not the plant. Check your local extension office and your USDA hardiness zone before planting anything I talked about today, because they know your ground and I do not. I will see you in the next one.